ArcheAge, a game that at one point had extreme levels of hype for a Western port, is now regarded as abandonware pawned off for pennies to a company with a reputation for putting games out to pasture permanently. My question is, what happened to ArcheAge? ArcheAge is a free-to-play game with an optional subscription that is loosely based on a collection of novels entitled The ArcheAge Chronicles, penned by Korean author Jeon Min-hee. A very brief rundown of the novel is good guys and bad guys, let's obtain that grain, gamers, which is fairly par for the course for Korean MMO story adaptation. Naturally, the game came out first in Korea, followed shortly by Japan, and then Russia about 1 year after Korea's initial release. By then, ArcheAge had already turned a few heads in the Western world and began to generate a bit of hype for a potential port to Europe and North America, which XL Games, the developer of ArcheAge, was more than happy to provide. Much to the happiness of those interested, the developer actually announced a Western port, with alpha and beta access being gated behind the purchase of Founder Packs. Founder Packs were early buy-in bundles with an assortment of in-game items exclusive to the bundles, a head start bonus, and gifted subscription time that would not be used during the alpha and beta stages. After alpha and beta testing began, Western players got to experience what ArcheAge was, and to be fair, the game was actually pretty good. For an MMO made in 2013, the graphics were quite impressive due to the CryEngine. It featured a world devoid of loading zones and transition zones, and sported a healthy offering of class variety with a pick 3 system to support any combat playstyle the player could come up with. Aside from combat skills, the game also offered a veritable cornucopia of crafting skills, varying from the obvious gathering of resources and production of goods, to the esoteric practice of writing sheet music and studying other languages to become multilingual. PvP was a central focus of the game back then and was the de facto endgame, with the possibility to raid player-driven merchant ships for loot all the way to declaring war on a rival clan and participating in siege warfare in order to destroy their castle and claim the lands they own. As well, the player races were divided into 2 continents, which also dictated beginning allegiances. Easterners were always hostile to Westerners, and Westerners were always hostile to Easterners. These were just a few of the activities available to players that completely enraptured the player base. However, as one could imagine, with something good must come something bad. And there were certainly some glaring issues the Western audience had with the early access of ArcheAge. The first main issue players had was with the labor system. In short, the labor system was touted as a way to bar people who had an excess of time to play from getting too far ahead of people who did not have the time to play, as an attempt to level the playing field, according to the developers. Labor would regenerate naturally over time at a rate of 10 points every 5 minutes while online, and 5 points per 5 minutes while offline. In order to do anything except fight monsters, fight other players, or travel, one would have to consume labor points in order to complete an action. As well, labor was shared across a player's account, so alternate characters would share the same labor pool as the main character. Some players felt this was unnecessarily restrictive, while others felt that this could lead to botting due to the staggered regeneration of online players compared to offline players. But the ArcheAge team was too busy counting the pre-order money to do anything about it. The second issue players had was housing availability. Unlike other MMOs such as RuneScape or Final Fantasy XIV, where housing is instanced or partially instanced respectively, ArcheAge boasted that the housing was 100% part of the in-game world and uninstanced, touting that this was done in order to provide a sense of community to players who bunked together. However, many players disagreed with this sentiment. Western players have been accustomed to housing being a part of the progression of the game. A place players can retreat to for privacy was essentially inalienable for some, and the inability for some players to get even the smallest of cottages was foreign. As well, the housing plots could be easily exploited by simply not being courteous of potential neighbors. For example, a housing plot could be 32 by 32, which could theoretically support 4 8 by 8 housing structures. However, that relies on everyone placing their structure where it needs to be. One could simply just place their building in the middle of the 32 by 32 plot, preventing anyone else from setting something down next to them. Once again, the developers cared little for this plight, which is something that blew up in their face, obviously. That's kind of a recurring theme through ArcheAge's history, but hey, what could possibly go wrong? Despite the issues some players had, closed beta ended, which was then followed by a brief open beta until finally ArcheAge was released to the public entirely. And oh boy was it bad. As mentioned before, Day 1, or more appropriately Day -4, was the defining moment of what it meant to be a subscriber instead of a free-to-play player. Patrons who had the 4-day early start flooded into the live servers and began speeding through content they had early knowledge about, and more importantly, being able to scoop up precious limited land in a matter of hours, leaving almost nothing for patrons coming in late and virtually nothing for Day 1 players. The land grab was so intense, hostile faction members either swam or sailed across the great ocean between the continents so that they could take land on the opposing faction's continent, much to the ire of other players. Despite the hostile players' houses being listed as hostile and able to be attacked, nothing could be done to demolish the house. Some servers had such terribly invasive land grabbers that entire housing communities were developed by the enemy, and nothing could be done to stop them beside attacking the land grabber before they placed the house down. The 4-day head start ended, and then launch proper happened, which was even worse than one could imagine. Not only did the concerns from beta come to fruition, but with full release came the release of free-to-play, or as players found out, was more like free-to-log-in. And even that statement is a stretch, considering login queues numbered in the tens of thousands for servers. To no one's shock, the two major problems pre-release players had were the major deal breakers for free-to-log-in players. Without a house, crafting, gathering, and storage was extremely difficult, if not downright impossible for a few recipes, and labor point regeneration was severely stunted compared to premium players. Where a premium player would earn 10 points per 5 minutes online and 5 per 5 minutes offline, free players could only earn 5 per 5 minutes and nothing while offline. A quick remedy to this restriction was discovered, however, simply finding a way to not be kicked by the AFK timer to maximize labor regeneration. In turn, this clogged the already congested login queues even further. As well, a drawback to free-to-play games in general is the introduction of bots and cheats. When a barrier for entry is non-existent and the game is popular, bots showing up is almost a guarantee. In most games, the players and developers work together in order to combat the influx of bots through reporting, but naturally, ArcheAge worked a little bit differently. Bots were generally tolerated because they did the dirty work of gathering materials for crafting that no one else wanted to do. In fact, when a ban wave finally did Thanos snap a few of the bots, prices for materials and goods skyrocketed because of how ingrained botting for resources was and how terrible it was to gather certain goods. As time went on, botting became a tolerated activity, at least during the early days of the game's release. Secondly, reporting bots actually cost a legitimate player money in both literal and metaphorical terms. In order to report a player, the reporter had to spend 25 labor to file the report, which would only be refunded if the report turned out to be legitimate. In the Korean version, reporting players allowed bounty hunters to arrest the reported player and bring them to the endgame jail. But the developers quickly realized that, hey, that can be easily abused, we should probably get rid of it. Unsurprisingly, they were right and it was easily abused. Who would have thought? Speaking of different regions behaving differently, a new problem arose for the Western audience: a gross imbalance of racial makeup. There were 4 races available on release, 2 for each continent. Nuians and Elves were exclusive to the West, and Firan and Harani to the East. Pop quiz: what went wrong with this distribution? I'll give you a few seconds to take a guess. Time's up. The answer is furries. Anyone who has played an MMO for more than 5 minutes can easily notice that less exotic races such as humans and elves are as rare as me uploading a video, especially when the more exotic races are furry or scaly related. For ArcheAge, this meant that most servers were severely imbalanced between factions, and for a game which was focused more on endgame PvP, spelled disaster for the minority. Don't worry though, the developers put up a faction restriction on servers, eventually. That was initially only a recommendation instead of a hard lockout. Official responses to the woes of the player base could be summarized as, there are people who run this game? Where? To their credit, Trion Games did their best to get permission from XL Games for what needed to be changed at a fundamental level in order to ensure the survival of the game. But XL Games refused almost everything suggested. Most exploits being abused by the Western audience had been problems in the Korean version since day one. But the Korean players rarely acted upon them for fear of being banned or even facing legal repercussions. In fact, XL Games allegedly refused to authorize changes to the game because they found the notion of Western gamers exploiting game loopholes unbelievable. Funnily enough, even when Trion was given the go-ahead to begin plugging the gaping holes in the ship, the player base had become so accustomed to exploiting that there was actually backlash for the new policy changes. Despite their efforts to try to prevent the ArcheAge cash cow from being sunk, Trion was usually caught up in the controversy itself, mainly due to a spotted history of rule enforcement. It was a well-known secret that some of the most powerful players used illegal modifications of the game, who were allegedly ignored at large by game moderators. While the validity of these allegations are unverified, there have been a multitude of streamers that have quite clearly shown advantageous mods off on their stream in violation of the TOS, with no punishment being levied on them. To put it simply, the initial impressions of ArcheAge faded quickly. Within 1 to 2 months, the player base took a nosedive to lows that rival the average player count in 2019. The game enjoyed brief periods of boosted player numbers due to fresh start servers or events being added, but the damage had already been done and the game was doomed to a steady decline of popularity until it was finally pawned off to Gamigo, wherein even some of the most die-hard ArcheAge fans lost the faith they had in the game. Considering Gamigo's history, I don't blame them. ArcheAge's overall problem was that it was a game featuring a monetization scheme that was too foreign for Western players, and it encouraged a playstyle of selfishness and the powerful getting even more powerful. New players had next to no hope of actually playing the game unless they forked over real money to try to get an edge or were close with someone who was already powerful. Now, ArcheAge lives on as a shell of its former potential, with some private servers trying to breathe life into the game that, for all intents and purposes, was great. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Feels good to be done with that video. Who's calling me? XL Games, what do you want? How did you know about my video? You want me to talk about your new game. Why would I do that? I played your game already. I don't want to do it again. You'll pay me how much? Alright, I'll think of something. So, As it turns out, as I was editing the video, ArcheAge Unchained got revealed, which allegedly will drop the subscription fee and remove all the pay-to-win items from the store. It just kinda shows how badly the store hurt the game, considering that the developers make mention that Unchained and Retail will be two different games because changing Retail would break it. As much as I railed the game, I had a bit of fun in ArcheAge, and I hope that Unchained saves the game. I'm sorry for bad audio here and there, but I'm not used to recording for 40 to 45 minutes at a time, and recording audio destroyed my voice. Hopefully, the more I record, the more I'll get used to it. Thank you guys for watching.